So for our next talk in this session, I'm happy to introduce Berenice Wohlbroek. She is the Director of Solution Delivery at OntoForce. With over 15 years of experience in the life sciences, Berenice and her team are providing expertise and customization to various life science clients to support their journey with Discover, which turns their unstructured data into actionable insights for a variety of activities like target identification, clinical R&D, bioinformatics. Berenice holds a master's in bioinformatics and molecular biology. Before joining OntoForce, she worked at the Pasteur Institute of Lille and at BASF Plant Science, where she worked on gene discovery for crop improvement by combining multi-omics analysis with internal and public data. We met at a Fair Data Hackathon at BioIT World in 2019, where we used the Discover tool to explore connections between JGI datasets and publications, and it was a lot of fun. And today she's going to tell us about Fair and more, boosting insights for life sciences. Thank you, Bernie.
Thank you, Kirsten. Hi, it's a pleasure to be presenting today. Today I would like to discuss about FAIR and how FAIR can enable boosting insights for life science. We will talk about knowledge graph and how to bring access to knowledge. Then basically, being a scientist or a data scientist, you take part of your journey by wondering, like, where are the data set where are the data that might support your hypothesis, what are the data set that might be interesting for your next analysis, etc. Then you can have a ton of questions during your day to get access to data. Then here I put, for example, some example, like I would like to retrieve all publication about nitrogen uptake in monocot, or which are the protein domain identified in a certain fungi class, what kind of plant microbiomes experiments have been run on root for corn, for which there is a metabolite profiling that has been captured. Is my certain gene of interest might be associated with drug recovery, etc., etc. Then you might have a question to get access to, like, what is already known about a certain topics, and basically you will reach out to different websites, resources, etc., to evaluate that. Then, in average, researchers are spending about like 1 day per week by searching and gathering information. And if we are talking about data science, to build this graph neuronal network, in general, data scientists spend about 80% of their time on preparing and managing data for analysis. And in fact, it's probably the part that they don't like that much. Then how can we foster the access to this knowledge, the access to this data set? Then, in fact, all the information about certain experiments, certain data set, what kind of knowledge, this experiment is really gathered across different silos of information. Then you might have hundreds of databases that are accessible, that are relying on some part of the information. You might have some files on your computers or on a server somewhere that is also having some knowledge of interest for your question. Then, as a scientist or as a data scientist, it's quite really exhaustive to be able to screen about all this siloed information to find what part of what kind of resource will have the right information that I would like to assess. You might also completely miss an opportunity. Like, for example, if there would be a resource that you don't know about and that you will not screen for it, perhaps this data source have like super interesting data set or something that will help you in your analysis, but you just miss out of it because this resource is not clearly indicated. You don't know about it. Then it's like how to be able to help scientists to be able to know, like, what kind of information can be retrieved where. And if you search, for example, a question about nitrogen uptake, that you can really easily identify which are the database or where the information, where you can fish for information. On top of having the information really silo across different systems, data could be really not harmonized. meaning that you can have, for example, in a certain database or in certain resource, the mention of drug recovery, where in another resource, for example, in an Excel file that have about phenotyping, you will find that it's about DRR. If you don't know, if you don't have the information that DRR is in fact a synonym of drug recovery, that is something that either you will consider that information as being two different phenotypes, or you might just completely skip the information about DRR that was interesting to you. Same here for the compounds. Here, if I'm interested about a certain compound, I might have identifier about the compound, I might have generic name, I might have chemical names, etc. Then how do I bring the information, access the information in a harmonized way, that if I search, for example, here trehalose, doesn't matter if I formulate my question around trehalose or about the Campbell ID or the chemical name, I should be able to retrieve all the information. Doesn't matter the naming that has been used in the data capturing. Then how could you work on a research system? Then there is a principle of a guideline that has been depicted like a few years ago in order to foster the reuse of the data. Then that are FAIR for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I will not go to the 15 guidelines for FAIR, but in short, you need to really add metadata to your data set. And when you generate a data set, you need to create the metadata in order to have your data set being useful. That starts with, for example, using sufficient identifier, sufficient metadata around what is this data set about. It should be accessible. Alors, accessible most of the time is really interpreted like I should open my data set to the rest of the world. That's not true. You need to open the data set to the people that have the access right to it. But what you need to make it accessible is make sure that, for example, you can distribute it to a standard protocol, like, for example, an API call or something that you have an FTP that people will be able to basically get access to this data. Interoperability, then here you need to make sure that, for example, if you have an internal identifier for your compounds for a certain chemical, that you will create the reference to standard, if there is some standard that are available, and I will talk about standard right after. You need to make sure that you will create the reference that my internal chemical called 1, 2, 3 is in fact referring to the Campbell entry with a Campbell identifier. And you need to create the awareness where you can, about standard data source, about reference data source, and really identify where this information could be interoperate with other data sets. Reusable will be also like adding sufficient metadata in order to for example, provide sufficient information about the experiment, how the data was captured, etc., what was the experimental design, in order to make sure that this data could be reused, for example, in a reanalysis with other data sets. Then once you have these FAIR guidelines, then in fact, you can start to reuse the data, but also to recombine the data that are coming from different data sources. And I will focus about how you can use FAIR to support knowledge graph in a consolidated knowledge and providing an integrated knowledge. Then first, what are the knowledge graph? Then the knowledge graph, it's you can really imagine like it's a network of information where basically you will have nodes that will be like object, and you will have relationship between these nodes that will be your age. Then in a knowledge graph, it's something that will help you to reasoning on your data. Then, for example, I will have the drug have a certain target that is a gene. and my gene is part of a pathway. Then all the information would be like a triple, like subject, verbs, and object. And basically, you can start reasoning on this graph. For example, if I want to search all the pathway for which a certain disease have drug that could be used for curate the disease, then you see that I can work to the graph, to the network, to reason that. Then, for example, my disease is indicated for the drugs, and from the drug I can go to the target, and I can then see which are the pathways that are underlying for which my gene is involved. Then, in order to build a knowledge graph, you might want to integrate different resources. Alors, not everything is meant to be a knowledge graph. You might be good to integrate ontologies in your knowledge graphs. And basically, ontology is like classification, hierarchical system that define a certain area. Like, for example, you will have the ontology for trait ontology that organize plant trait information into a hierarchy. And that provide description like who is part of which, or which are the child for a certain trait, what kind of relationship do you have between the trait, and also some information about, for example, name, synonym, description about all the traits. And these ontology are most of the time really domain specific. And of course, in your knowledge graph, if you build a knowledge graph for a certain domain, you want to capture the ontology that are like recognized like standard in your domain. What you want to integrate in the knowledge graph, it's also metadata, and in between the ontology and the metadata, you might have also the reference data set. For example, you can consider that for publication, PubMed is one of the standard data set that you want to integrate. For metadata, you want to integrate into your knowledge graph everything that is around, for example, an experiment. Like if we are talking about an experiment, you want to integrate in your knowledge graph what type of experiment is it, which are the samples that was used, from which organisms this sample were extracted, what was the condition of the sampling, etc. You might also integrate part of the data into your knowledge graph. For example, if we are talking about an expression analysis and you have a perturbation analysis, you might want to capture in the knowledge graph that some genes are differentially expressed for a certain condition. What you don't want to include in the knowledge graph would be, for example, all the matrix data, like, for example, really like the expression data, the raw expression data with your genes and the sample with the expression level. That is typically stuff that you will not store in the knowledge graph, because this information is just basically difficult to apply a reasoning on. You really need to have like matrix tools to extract the information. Similar, like if you have run a sequencing analysis, you don't want to store the sequence or anything about the read on the knowledge graph, but what you want to capture in the knowledge graph is that you have run an experiment, that you have used sample, and that you might have make a reference to the original, to the location where the files have been located or where the file will be available, that you can call on these files afterwards if you need them. But the sequence per se should not enter the knowledge graph. Then a good knowledge graph, let's say, it should be something that will cover your ontologies to make sure that you have standard vocabularies, that you will have synonyms to search in the graph. You will have all your metadata, and then you will have part of the data. And here you have to make the distinction between everything that is matricial, that have a really specific format, then that should be stored on the side of your knowledge graph, and everything that is still about reasoning or being able to pinpoint a certain experiment, a certain setup, then that is good to have it in your knowledge graph. Then, in order to consolidate a knowledge graph, you have this information that are silos from different setups. Then you might need data standard to consolidate the information. You probably have a box like that at home with all kinds of cables and phone charger. Ideally, you want to have or we would all like to have one data standard, meaning that only one cable to all charge our phones. The topic is there for several years on the table. There is just no consolidation from the market on having only one cable that can charge. Doesn't matter which brand you are, your phone you are. You still have specific, and you just need to be able to deal with the diversity. Then, in order to bring things together, you need to accept that you might deal with different standards and that some of the data might be consolidated to with one ontology or with one reference standard. For example, you might have some genomic data set that will be consolidated to NCBI genes, and you will have some other data set that will be consolidated or referenced to Ensembl. It's okay. It's diversity. You know that you have two different systems, but then after you need to have a strategy to deal with these different standards. Then let's say that here I have an adapter for which that allow me to translate any of my original standard into the reference standard that I decide to use as my main standard. Then you can make you can use this strategy basically to try to translate from one standard, from one format to another in order to have compatibility in the data. It works fine, except like, let's say that here, this cable and this cable, they don't trigger all the information. And therefore, there is some information that gets lost when you transfer this to the main standard, because just that this reference doesn't exist between, this mapping doesn't exist between these two standards. Although you might have an existing mapping from this standard to this one, and perhaps to this one to another one that will allow you to go to that one. Then you not only need to, a mapping is already, a one-to-one mapping is already good, but in fact, you need to go further into your strategy to really make sure that you are using the cross reference from each standard in order to have a consolidated view. Then how to build the knowledge graph. Now we saw that how we can extract this information from how we can build the knowledge graph and how we can use standards. Now how that will result. In fact, let's say that I have my different silos of information, my different resources that could be from different formats or that are not really harmonized. Then basically for each of the original sources, you can start to tag what are the different entities that are lying, for example, here, if I'm talking about the JSON file, that will become my nodes, and how they get related based on the structure of the file. Same for the database. We can then take all the entry into the database will be like a kind of nodes, and the relationship between these nodes will become my links in the knowledge graph, etc. And then you can derive this approach, and for each resource, you can make a knowledge graph of the information. Now, the data standard will be really useful when you need to map this information. Then know that you have the cross-reference between the different resources, the different standards. You can start to say, okay, but in fact, this node here is corresponding to this node. And this one here is corresponding to that one. And by doing that, you see that you can reconsolidate all the information and silo for the information that was really disparate in terms of format. By translating them into knowledge graph, by using all the standard and all the cross information, integration of information, you can really reconstruct a knowledge graph that will go across silos of information. That will allow you to disambiguify the information. For example, the use of standard. In the use of standard, one of the things that you can do, and using the knowledge graph, you can start to disambiguify information. For example, if I research for ALS, it could be that I mean about the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, that is a disease, or I can mean about a chemical or a gene. And basically, with semantic and the knowledge graph, you can start really to differentiate what do I mean, what kind of context I'm looking for. On the other hand, the knowledge graph is built and you can navigate on this data. Then I have my consolidated knowledge graph, and basically, for my users, the goal would be to have a self-service knowledge. Then that, as a scientist, as a data scientist, I have one resource where I can connect and search for information. I can perhaps directly assess if, for example, one of my questions was if a certain gene, RAB7, had a link to a drug, I can perhaps directly add that to the knowledge graph. I might have some more complicated information that I have reference from the original resource. And for example, here I might say, okay, oh, I find that there is information available in a certain system. I can find that in the knowledge graph, and that can redirect me to the original data source for me to have access to the data. Once you have this self-service for person, that's a good thing, is that you can serve it also for machine to machine. And then, for example, you might go for applying systematic algorithm on this graph, deep learning on this graph in order to extract prediction, to extract new information. Then this data curation effort, or this consolidation of data, it's something that should become really in the routine of everyone in order to support this self-knowledge access. It's what we do with Discover at OntoForce, that is basically our knowledge platform. But it's really asking like everyone to participate to this effort. Alors, you don't have to go to the historical data source and start to curate this data. But if you start as of today to make sure that your data gets fair, you allow to have this kind of integration of information and access to knowledge easier. That will make your work easier in the next iteration one when you will need to access the data. That will make the work easier also in order to make, have the machine scrolling on the data and being able to bring the power also to artificial intelligence and be able to mine this data more efficiently. Then that's basically my main message. Like bring fair into your daily routine. Will help you tomorrow for yourself, but also help the community on building up on this knowledge. Okay. Just a small word then about the Discover platforms, and basically we are doing that with Discover, that you can access on discover.com with a little bit more than 140 public data source. But you can also start to include your own data on the platform and really get an augmented knowledge graph using at the same time the public data and your internal data all together. Good, that's it. Do you have questions?
Thanks so much, Bernice. I guess you can stop the screen share now.
Okay, yep.
Great. So we have a question in the chat from Chris Mungle. How scalable is the OntoForce graph database technology? IMG, which is a resource that JGI has around 65 billion genes, each with potentially many ontological annotations.
Yeah. Alors, the system is actually with our public data resource, we are about like 25 billions of nodes, but it's not triples. That it means that is already consolidated information. We are working on only one server with this public data, but in fact, after you can start to shard your system and have a federation between Discover server in case one server will not handle it, would not be sufficient to handle it.
Cool. Yeah. So I think what I really like about your talk and what I really like about that platform is sort of what you were saying at the end, right? Like that it's not necessarily about using Discover for your tools. It's about encouraging the community to adopt metadata standards, to think about and try to understand ontologies. And this is an area where JGI is attempting to, make our data more accessible, make our data more fair so that it can be included in other people's analysis. And, I think one of the things that we've heard a bunch from users when we've been conducting some of our user research around search and access of data is that everybody would love to have a Google-like search for scientific data, right? And so I'm just wondering, in your experience, given that you've been doing this for a while, how close are we to something like that? What kind of effort would be required on the part of all of us to get toward this goal of Google for Science? Something that I interpret as being like really intuitive. I can search kind of for what I want and get relevant results.
Yeah. Then I think that I don't know. Then it's funny because in fact Google is not really putting or is still finding a single resource, right? Where in fact in the knowledge graph you really want to work and interpret the knowledge graph, and that is, I think that is something, you know, that need to combine at the same time the knowledge graph and kind of an NLP, you know, that will analyze the sentence and will recognize that, okay, you have asked a question about that genes and that trait, then we need to search a connection in the knowledge graph between that gene and that trait. We need to understand in the question, like what kind of verbs does that mean, and then you can map basically to the type of age that are underlying that. Then I think it's a combination of both, but it needs data consolidation. If the system, you can rely part of AI to curate some of part of the data, but in order to have this curation system work, you need to have a good ground basis. And it's really like a community effort and collaborative effort to make sure that we put our data to a sufficient level of quality that it can be reused and reinterpreted into a system. What is really funny is like I've been thinking about that this week. Then on social media, you know, people are really making the effort to tag, for example, to put hashtag, to put reference to person, etc. You know, it's almost something that we need, like in our publication, in the literature, in the information that we are sharing, like that we are able to say, hey, I'm saying something about this object. And it's really like taking an effort of the community in order to be able to make this data in a very reusable state, format, and information.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's pretty hard, and then you see the effort people are willing to undertake for their tweets, and it's like, how could we have something comparable for scientific data? And there are some really interesting efforts to do natural language processing on publications and proposal information and the data itself to try and help with some of the automated tagging, but it's still something that feels like it needs to be vetted by a human. We had another question come in from Laura Super. Also, what about analysis for science? We're still not allowing the public to get access to clusters easily. So clusters of proteins, clusters of information, I'm guessing. But what do you think about somehow making these kind of analysis products, I think, more easily accessible?
It's yeah, I think that I think one of the issue is like you know, like ask everyone if they or ask for funding for AI, and that is the trend, right? Ask funding for data curation. That is a little bit less sexy, and that is you know, like not in the trends. But I think that there need to be have a really change in the way that we are considering data. 10 years ago, we were producing data just to make like we were doing like one experiment, generating this data. We were extracting the conclusion from this experiment, and then the data was like archiving, and no one was getting into it anymore. Already we made quite a good shift on making this data a little bit more accessible, but now it's also taking it to a next level, like, and how do I extract this knowledge? How do I make it available? And then it's trying to find like funding or trying to find consortium that will be able to host this kind of cluster of information.
Yeah, and I think I actually interpreted her question as clusters around like data clusters, and what she meant was high performance computing resources and like clusters of computers to be able to do analysis and to do work. And I think that's a bigger challenge that, you know, you could imagine reducing the friction between, you know, scientists and the work that they want to do by enabling cloud computing access and, you know, linking to the data and being able to help people find the data and access it through APIs.